Welcome back to the Visible Risk Masterclass series on cyber risk quantification. I'm Dr. Jack Freund, and today I'm joined by Vince Dasta, Head of Risk Delivery at Visible Risk. Welcome, Vince.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Organizations that you've worked with that are trying to figure out CRQ solutions, scoping's a big deal for this. So how do some of the best organizations think about scoping when they're trying to put their CRQ solutions in place?
And I think you're right. I mean, scoping is the foundation for most of what we do with risk quantification. And by scoping, what I mean by that is determining what are the scenarios that we're going to look at, how are we going to evaluate them, and where are we going to get the information, the data from. And one of the things that I think a lot of organizations struggle with is when they do this, they try to be overly granular. Mm-hmm. And we try to get into very detailed, very specific scenarios. And one of the things that I like to do, and what I think companies that do this well do most often, is you look at the scenarios in a couple of different perspectives. What are the scenarios that are going to happen most often? Right? These are the things that you're going to deal with day in and day out. They're probably going to be somewhat high frequency or things that you are able to manage. What are the things that could be really bad if they happen? Meaning the kind of the high impact, low frequency type scenarios. And then also, what are the ultimate bad day, these catastrophic type scenarios that we really want to understand? And I think this is important because what it lets those organizations that do this well do is look across a couple of different things, and that ultimately is going to make their analysis actionable. And that's the goal of any of this, is what's the scenario that's going to help me make a decision or run my business in a way that I can actually do something with the output. And I think when you look at this, I mentioned a couple of things, and kind of like your perspective on what does make a CRQ program, successful, or what are the organizations that are doing this well doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think expectation management is really important. Mm-hmm. The difference between a boil the ocean type of scenario and these really granular things that a lot of security analysts and CISOs are sort of thinking about, and sort of connecting those two things. So I think the organizations that do this really well are connecting the granular things in their scoping exercises to the big picture things. And it depends on the audience. Right. The boards of directors, the executives, they want to know, how much cyber risk do I have? Full stop.
Right.
And as you know, it takes a lot of granular scenarios to be able to really point to those things very, very well. So I think finding that connection between there's missing or broken controls on these systems that align to these scenarios, that align to these categories of risk. I think that's one thing that organizations do really well, is they do that scoping well, they do that containerization of big picture stuff into granular things. And then the other thing they do really well is I think they have adopted data gathering techniques. I think they've adopted perspectives on probabilistic thinking generally that really help them. I know you've experienced a lot of this, of organizations that are trying to drive towards zero cybersecurity risk.
Sure. Yeah.
Does not exist anywhere, right? There's always some risk in a non-zero kind of way. There's always going to be a little bit of risk that way. So organizations that are realistic about what that means, and when their executives and their boards are discussing this, they realize zero risk is not an option. So they're taking intelligent decisions about what are the right things to do that way. But that's a trick, right? So when we're trying to take these probabilistic distributions of loss that we might produce at this granular level, and then bring them up to these board level stuff, what's the right way to communicate that? Because these boards don't always have a deep backgrounds in stats and probabilistic thinking. Right?
I completely agree, and I think that's where a lot of companies get hung up. Is that a thing I hear all the time from executives, from boards, is that they've gone through a risk quantification process and it feels like an academic exercise at the end, right? Lots of charts, lots of graphs, all these things, and those are effective in some cases. But I think what a lot of organizations struggle with is what I call risk storytelling, right? Is that the reason that we're doing this, and the best way to convey these kind of results to audiences that don't work on this all the time, is to tell a story with it. And when you look at this, you can take things that would be loss exceedance curves and these complicated histograms and things like that, and you can dial this in by using that data to tell the story that you want. So rather than say this is the loss exceedance curve of our scenario and this is you can pick any point on this line. One of the things that works really well is to highlight the specific story that you're trying to tell. What's your use case? Why are we doing this analysis? And what's the decision that we're trying to make? Maybe it's just important to know that there's a less than 1% chance of a loss exceeding a certain amount. I can use that data and I can use that probabilistic analysis to do that just by highlighting one point. And I think you can do this in a couple of different ways, but if the audience isn't used to seeing this all the time, or your executives, you need to be able to explain it as in plain English as a story. And when you do this and when you do this well, you can ultimately influence those decisions. But you're doing it in a transparent way that you're showing your work, and it's beyond the kind of just subject matter expert estimate at that stage.
Right.
And I think another piece of this, and I mentioned some of this loss exceedance things and using some of this to understand. Another, I think, industry where this comes in all the time is with insurance, and looking at insurance coverages and are we adequately insured. So from your perspective, and I know you've worked on this with quite a few different organizations, how are those companies that are doing this well using these analyses and using risk quantification in their insurance discussions?
Well, that's just like you said. You have to have this sort of storytelling here, and the story sometimes comes from the questions that organizations are asking.
Right.
And one of those questions commonly is, how much cyber insurance should we buy?
Yeah.
I think about this as a really basic sort of way. Years ago, I inventoried all of the furniture and all the things inside of my house to figure out, do I have the right amount of coverage for this? I'm a bit of a nerd, so I guess that's fine.
Right.
But this is what organizations have to do. How much loss could I possibly have to know if I have the right amount of coverage?
Yeah.
So for organizations that are really trying to figure out, do we have sufficient coverage, too little, too much? This is one thing that cyber insurance or the cyber risk quantification can really help with, is better understanding how much loss potential we have for different types of scenarios.
Yeah.
A lot of brokers, a lot of underwriters have calculators that they kind of use back of the envelope. One time I did this when I was inside of an organization. I was really proud because the estimates that I built from my CRQ calculations met with what the underwriters came up with.
Yeah.
And I thought, high five me, that's the right amount, right? But I think that helps organizations sort of do a check against these kind of things. Now, the important thing is, if you're relying on the quantification that your underwriter or your insurance company is providing you, they don't insure everything. As you know, there's a lot of costs that we could consider in CRQ assessments that you're still going to bear. They're just uninsurable. The amount of time your people are spending not working on the things they should be working on,
That's right.
and responding to an incident, you generally don't get that kind of thing covered. So that helps out a lot. But that's I think a really important part of this is organizations understand the difference between complete loss potential, what insurance companies call ground loss, all of everything, and then there's sort of a lesser version of that, which is what are the stuff that I'm going to be able to cover, and that helps you figure out what type of coverages I need and what's the right amount.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about scoping, and I think this is a really key piece of that is having the objective of your analysis well understood in the beginning. Why are we doing this analysis? Is it to understand my total loss potential, that ground loss, or do I need to make sure that I have adequate coverage for my risk appetite in a particular line on my policy? And I think when you do this, and when you look at it from this perspective, insurance naturally has an information asymmetry problem, right? I mean, it's this common thing, and usually you look at that from the insurers or from the underwriters, is that they're trying to write policies and they don't have all the information. Well, what that means, though, is for the organizations that are doing this and are buying these policies, they have the opportunity then to have that information, right? And they can make a more informed buying decision and actually turn the tables. But I think a lot of organizations, when they go and buy insurance, are relying on what their broker tells them or what their insurance companies come up with through their formula, whereas they really have the upper hand here and probably aren't leveraging it very effectively.
Never ask your barber if you need a haircut.
That's right. That's right. Well, we talked around insurance a little bit too, but I think also when you look at that, some of the other analyses that we can do that have to do with internal audit and some of those findings and some of those kinds of things. I think there's a key use case there as well.
Yeah. Well, so if you're trying to build these sort of internal CRQ assessments to sort of check or build an additional scope around one that your underwriter may be providing you, the elephant in the room is, where do I get the data to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something I've seen for years, is that companies never think they have enough data, or that they don't know how to use the data that they have. And there's kind of the famous quote that you have more data than you think you do, and you probably need less than you think you do either.
Hat tip Douglas Hubbard.
That's right. And when you look at this in perspective, I think understanding the value of the information and the value of the data that you're using is really important, because there's a lot of different sources of data within a company. Some of it is very easy to collect. Some of it's very hard to collect. And we look at this today on a spectrum. So we can look at, if I want to evaluate the effectiveness of my email security platform, well, I can do this a lot of different ways. I can look at this from the outside in. I can look at DNS records. I can look at threat intelligence, these kinds of things. I can interview my email administrator. We can look at how the tools are configured, what controls are in place, and these kinds of things. But all of those require some level of interpretation, some level of analysis on top of. Or we could objectively test that data, right? And we could send or simulate a phishing campaign, or we can send emails that match certain types of signatures, and we can objectively measure which of those are delivered. And if you look at the value of that information, that's actually the highest value information. That tells me, is this going to be effective or not? Or am I susceptible to this or not? And there's always a spectrum on that, but that's very high, high value density information.
It's live fire testing of your control.
That's right. That's right. And I think a lot of companies try to approach it from that bottom up of, well, we can do hundreds of hours of interviews. We can talk to everybody that's part of this and all the controls and all the configurations, but they have to put that analysis on top of that. And some companies are good at that, but it takes a lot of time, and it's commonly not very cost effective for the value of the information that you're getting. That's why I think the companies that are doing this well are looking at this not just from a frameworks perspective, but from an effectiveness and an operational point of view.
Yeah, there's been a disconnect between the telemetry data that a lot of security teams have about their actual control environment and how that fits into CRQ risk assessments, and actually finding ways to take this actual data that shows a state of something, as opposed to using a more, let's call it, subjective view of what we think control strength looks like. I think is a much better way to go.
Yeah, and I think that it also requires the ability to break that scenario down when you do this. So I don't know that I need to test the delivery of a certain type of email to my email box unless I've broken that scenario down and understand that that's the probable vector that this attack is going to play out on. And that information is really valuable to me. So if you don't take that approach, and we keep coming back to scoping on this, but if you don't take that approach to it, it's very easy to miss the forest for the trees.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Speaking of the forest and the trees, right? We talked a little bit about internal audit, right?
Yeah.
And one of the use cases that a lot of my clients use is supplementing that audit risk assessment or justifying and prioritizing audit findings. What are some things that you've seen or that you've done that allows you to do that in a more effective way?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's any secret that organizations that have multiple lines of defense, 3 lines of defense, have the sort of risk function in the middle in line 2 and audit is line 3, and we sort of think about how does that interact a little bit. And I've seen a lot of, I don't know if it's animosity is the right word, but it's always a lot of always a lot of friction between what internal audit says is high risk and what the risk department says is high risk. So that's one of the things I think where CRQ really helps, is to provide a level playing field so everybody sort of understands these are things we've identified broadly that are high risk scenarios, high risk departments, high risk operations. At the very least, it helps organizations better understand and align their 3 lines of defense profile so that we're working on the same kind of things, that you have actual lines of defense on the things that are the highest risk for this organization.
That's right.
So the second line risk functions are able to sort of look at this broadly and say, we've talked to the business, we've used outside data, we've done live fire testing of things that we think can go wrong, and here's what this looks like. And then it makes sense to sort of communicate that perhaps broadly during the annual planning session that internal audit has, where they're thinking about what the audit universe looks like for the next year.
That's right.
To say, well, here's the things that we're testing. And then audit can point out, well, you're missing this whole area. They can begin to sort of layer in testing underneath that to double check things that they're doing. And it provides a single source of truth. I think nothing's really sort of worse than having two different audit committee meetings, one with risk and then one with audit, and they both say different things are high risk. Well, boards are going to be confused.
That's right.
What actually is the highest risk thing here?
That's right. Yeah.
And it helps you also, too, to sort of categorize these things so you don't have one department or the other bringing up, going back to scoping, these granular scenarios that we think are broken, saying this broken control is the highest risk thing in the organization. To the extent of missing the forest for the trees, these large-scale business operations things that are causing problems.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that risk quantification can do in this space is level the playing field and use a common set of language. Right. I think a challenge that I've seen a lot is audit will come in and this is a high risk or this is a critical risk. And there's not a clear definition for that, or if it is, it's a very qualitative or subjective one. Yeah. And I've had a client that has done this. The only work that they did was working with their audit committee to redefine what those mean in more quantitative terms. And saying that a high risk means that there's a greater than 10% chance of this issue causing a $1 million loss in a year, right? I think something like that is very helpful.
Whatever the appetite is of the board.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. And think about this in business outcomes and being able to contextualize that, because that helps me understand, should I spend $300,000 to remediate this issue, or should I accept this risk? Right. And if I accept this risk, what risk am I actually accepting, exactly. Right? And I think that's that communication piece of it, and that risk storytelling. How do you use these probabilistic methods? Is really helpful.
Yeah. Well, we talked a lot about scoping.
Yeah.
And then rolling things up. So let's just address that question directly. Then, how do you aggregate up these little risk scenarios into big categories of things?
Yeah, which is I think a really big problem. And part of the reason why this feels like an academic exercise for a lot of people is that you end up with pages and pages of analyses and all of these little micro scenarios that are all interesting. Maybe they're all important for a reason, but you can't give the whole picture anymore. So there's a couple of ways that I've seen companies do this well. One is talking about concentration risk. So if we look at a particular control or a particular tool or method and understanding what is the aggregate influence of that thing on a bunch of different risks. You look at this with some foundational controls like identity and access management, for example. It's very hard to contextualize a particular one or two scenarios for that. But what we can do is we can show that this one area influences 10 of the 15 top risk scenarios that we have. And I think that is a really good way to do this. It's not necessarily trying to aggregate and run complex simulations with thousands of scenarios and predict out what the next year looks like. Sometimes it's just looking at those individual pieces and where are the common threads there. I think that works really well. I think there's some companies that have been able to communicate very, very well on that. I think the other piece of that is just like we mentioned those high frequency, low impact risks, the things that are potentially catastrophic that we think we have different controls around that might be effective, and being able to bucket those and identify those, right? These are the risks that are going to happen multiple times every year. We're going to have these losses. And then we can focus then on what are we doing to control the magnitude of those and where are those controls working and not working. Vice versa, those things that the boards love to talk about that are in the headlines, that are these big catastrophic company-killing events. If you look at those, we can say that these are very unlikely, but how unlikely are they? And more importantly, what are we doing to keep them unlikely, right? And I think these are ways that you can do that. It's not just about trying to aggregate all the math and the numbers and run a big 10,000 scenario simulation every year.
Exactly. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. So thank you, Vince, for joining us. And stay tuned for our next episode in the CRQ Masterclass series presented by Visible Risk, where I'll be talking about how organizations can choose the right CRQ solution for them.